You know his name. You've heard the stories, maybe the fire, maybe the singing, maybe the poison. But what if I told you it's worse than you think? This isn't just a tale about a mad emperor. It's about a boy who was never supposed to survive a mother who ruled from the shadows and a city that watched power become poison. Tonight, we're diving deep into the life and terrifying legacy of Nero. From his blood-soaked rise to his paranoid theatrical fall, this is the story of one of the most infamous rulers in human history. But behind every tyrant, there's a trail of broken people. This is True Crime Echoes. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Monster in the Mirror. You know, sometimes I think the scariest villains in history aren't the ones who came out of nowhere. They're the ones who were made, built, sculpted, shaped by bloodlines, by trauma, by power that came too early and without boundaries. And today, I want to tell you the story of one of those villains. When we think of dictators, most of us jump to the 20th century Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin. But long before any of them were born, there was a boy in ancient Rome, born into chaos, fed lies, and raised like a puppet for his mother's ambition. And when he finally cut the strings, he didn't become a leader. He became something else entirely. He became Nero. Now, I'll be honest with you, when I first started reading about Nero, I thought I knew what to expect. Another tyrant with a god complex, another blood-stained throne. But as I dug deeper, I realized this was different. Nero didn't just rule Rome, he performed it. He staged his life like it was a never-ending play, and anyone who didn't fit the script, well, they didn't make it to the next act. He was theatrical, tragic, charismatic, and absolutely terrifying. But what makes his story so disturbing isn't just the murders or the scandals or the fire that nearly wiped out the entire city of Rome. It's that at the heart of all of it was a boy who never asked to be emperor, a boy who only ever wanted to sing, to dance, to be loved, and instead he was handed the world and then crushed by it. In today's story, we're going to walk through the life and unraveling of one of the most notorious emperors in Roman history. I'll show you where the monster began, the betrayals that built him, the people who tried to control him, the crimes that made his name unforgettable. And I'll be honest, there were moments while researching this episode where I just sat back and said, what the hell? Like, what actually happened here? How did we let this happen? And more importantly, how many times has history tried to repeat itself? Because Nero's story isn't just ancient history. It's a warning. It's what happens when the wrong person is handed unchecked power, when ego becomes law, and when no one, no teacher, no parent, no senator, no lover dares to say no. This is a story of art, obsession, betrayal, and blood. This is the story of Nero. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll understand why the Romans didn't just fear him. They remembered him, even centuries later. Let's begin. Chapter 2. Born in the Shadow of Madness. Nero was born in 37 AD. His name wasn't Nero back then. He was called Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. Not exactly catchy, I know, but it fit the world he was born into, complicated, ruthless, and full of secrets. And from the moment he opened his eyes, this kid was already surrounded by darkness. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was, let's just say, not a great man. He had a reputation for being cruel, violent, and downright unhinged. According to some sources, he once ran over a child in the streets of Rome on purpose just because he could. Just for fun. That's the kind of man Nero's father was. And his mother, oh, she was something else entirely. Her name was Agrippina the Younger. And if Nero's father was violent, Agrippina was calculated, dangerous in a different way. She came from one of the most powerful bloodlines in Roman history. She was the sister of Emperor Caligula, yes, that Caligula. The one famous for cruelty, delusions of godhood, and rumors that honestly make Game of Thrones look tame. And Agrippina learned a lot from her brother, maybe too much. See, in ancient Rome, women weren't allowed to hold power. But Agrippina didn't care about rules. She wasn't interested in being a background character. She wanted to be in control. And from the moment Nero was born, he was her ticket to that power. But things didn't go according to plan. When Nero was just a toddler, everything fell apart. Caligula, her brother the emperor, suddenly turned on her, banished her from Rome, no explanation. One day, she's in the palace untouchable. The next, she's gone. And Nero, barely 5 years old, was left behind. Then, as if that weren't enough, his father died, some say, of natural causes. Others whispered poison. And yes, the poison was rumored to have come from Agrippina herself. So picture this. You're a little boy. Your father is dead. Your mother is exiled. And no one tells you why. You're sent off to live with your aunt, hidden from the political chaos. No more palace, no more royal treatment, just silence and confusion, and maybe even fear. I keep thinking about that version of Nero. The child, not the tyrant. What does that do to someone? To be treated like a pawn, abandoned, brought back, moved around like a chess piece on a board you don't even understand. For a while, Nero faded into the background. Rome moved on. Caligula continued his reign of madness. And then he was assassinated, stabbed to death by his own guards. And that's when the story changed. Because suddenly Agrippina saw her chance. With Caligula dead, her exile was lifted. She returned to Rome, ready to restart her plan. The new emperor Claudius was her uncle, and from what we know, he had a soft spot for her. Within months, Agrippina was back in the palace, and Nero, just a boy, was once again at the center of a political storm. This time she was determined. She wanted her son on the throne no matter the cost, and she would marry, manipulate, and murder her way to make it happen. Looking back, it's hard not to wonder, did Nero ever really have a chance? Or was he always destined to become the man history would fear? Because before he was emperor, before the fires, the murders, the madness, he was a boy, and his childhood was already soaked in poison. Let's keep going. Chapter 3. A crown made of poison. By the time Agrippina returned to Rome, something had changed in her. She wasn't just ambitious anymore, she was hungry, calculated, focused. And now that she was back in the palace, she had a single mission: make Nero emperor, whatever it took. And her first move, marriage. Not for herself, not for love, but as strategy. She set her sights on a wealthy, powerful Roman politician named Pacinus Crispus. He had money status and, more importantly, a will. That's all Agrippina needed. She married him, charmed him, and within what felt like minutes, she and Nero were added to his will. And then, just as quickly, Crispus dropped dead. No proof, no charges, just whispers. People talked, of course they always do, but there was nothing anyone could do. It was all just too convenient. 1 minute she's a widow, the next she's a rich one, and now she had money and leverage. But Agrippina wasn't finished, not even close. Because the real prize wasn't a fortune, it was the emperor himself. Claudius, her uncle. Yes, her actual blood-related uncle. The man who had welcomed her back into Rome. And this is where things take a turn from ruthless to just plain disturbing. She seduced him, her own uncle, and in 49 AD, on New Year's Day, they got married. The people were horrified. This wasn't just taboo, it was scandalous even by Roman standards, and that says a lot. But Claudius? He didn't seem to care. He was awkward, bookish, and often underestimated. Agrippina was bold, beautiful, and terrifyingly intelligent. It was a match made in power, and once she had that ring, the real work began. She started reshaping the imperial image statues with her face coins with her name. She wasn't just the emperor's wife, she was his political partner, his equal in everything but title. And behind the scenes, she was orchestrating her most important move, yet getting Nero into the line of succession. Now Claudius already had a son. His name was Britannicus, and by all accounts, he was supposed to be the heir. But Agrippina saw him as an obstacle, nothing more. So she pushed and manipulated and played the game better than anyone. She convinced Claudius to officially adopt Nero as his son. And with that, the impossible happened. Nero, once a forgotten boy, shuffled from household to household, became a prince. Overnight. He was now legally the emperor's son, and more importantly, the next in line for the throne. He was only 12. From that moment on, everything changed for Nero. He was dressed in royal purple, tutored by Rome's best philosophers, including the famous Seneca. He gave public speeches, made appearances at the Senate, recited words written by others, but he delivered them with charm, with charisma. People started noticing him, and Agrippina made sure of it, but not everyone was impressed. Britannicus, Claudius's biological son, was watching all of this happen, and he was furious. Nero wasn't just a rival. He was an intruder, a performer, a boy who sang and danced and stole the spotlight, and the tension between the two of them was immediate and intense. They hated each other. Britannicus mocked Nero in public, called him by his birth name to insult him, Lucius, like a slap in the face. And Nero, well, he learned how to hate back. He learned how to compete. But in this twisted family drama, Agrippina was always one step ahead. She arranged for Nero to marry Claudius's daughter, his own stepsister, Claudia Octavia. Again, not for love, not for romance. Just another political move, another knot in the web. And then, just a few months before Nero's 17th birthday, something strange happened. Claudius, strong, aging, but still stable, suddenly fell ill. He sat down to dinner one night, ate his favorite mushrooms, and never got back up. Was it poison? Was it natural? No one knew for sure. But plenty of people had their suspicions, and most of those suspicions pointed to Agrippina. Why? Because Claudius had started to waver. Rumors say he was rethinking his decision to make Nero his heir. He wanted to put Britannicus back in line, but Agrippina wasn't about to let that happen. Not after everything she'd done. And so, coincidence or not, Claudius died. And the very next morning. Nero became Emperor of Rome. At just 16 years old, he had everything his mother had schemed for. Power, status, control. But he also had something else, something no one expected. A taste for the stage, a hunger to perform, and a slow-burning fury that was only just beginning. Let's keep going. Chapter 4. The Crown and the Cage. So Nero becomes emperor at 16. 16. Let that sink in. At an age when most of us were just trying to pass exams or figure out who we were, Nero was handed an empire. An entire empire, Rome. The most powerful civilization in the world at the time. And the thing is, he didn't really want it. Not exactly. Not like his mother did. For Agrippina, this was the moment she had been working toward for years. Every marriage, every calculated death, every public appearance, it had all been leading here. Her son on the throne, her hand behind the curtain, and in those early days she made sure everyone knew it. She didn't just stand by Nero's side. She sat on the imperial dais with him. She had coins minted with her face. She issued orders. She held court. It was as if she had become empress in everything but name. And honestly, for a while, Nero didn't resist. He probably didn't even know how. He was still a teenager surrounded by people far older, more cunning, more experienced. So he leaned on his mother. Or maybe she didn't give him a choice. But here's the thing, Nero wasn't stupid. He was impulsive, yes, immature, but not dumb. And very slowly he started to realize something. He wasn't the one in control. And that didn't sit well with him. As the months passed, you could feel the shift. Nero started to pull away. He stopped asking for Agrippina's advice. He stopped inviting her into meetings. He started spending more time with artists, actors, poets, people who praised him, not for his power, but for his talent. Or at least, what they pretended was talent. See, even back then, Nero had this obsession with performance. He didn't just want to rule, he wanted to be seen, heard, applauded. He wanted to sing, to act, to be admired like a god on stage, and he surrounded himself with people who fed that fantasy. And maybe that would have been harmless if he hadn't also started to resent his mother. Because to Nero, Agrippina wasn't just overbearing, she was a threat, a shadow he couldn't escape. And when she started criticizing his choices, especially his personal life, that's when things really turned. It started with a woman. Of course it did. Her name was Acte, a former slave. Not a noble woman. Not someone fit to be seen with an emperor. But Nero fell for her. Maybe because she wasn't like everyone else. Maybe because she didn't treat him like a pawn or a prince. Maybe she just made him feel free. Agrippina hated her. She did everything she could to break them up: lectures, threats, manipulation. But the more she pushed, the closer Nero and Acte became. And that's when Agrippina crossed a line. She turned to Britannicus. Yes, the son of Claudius, the boy who had once been the rightful heir before she erased him from the picture. Now she started publicly favoring him again, complimenting him, praising him, even hinting that maybe he was more deserving of the throne. And Nero snapped. He saw it for what it was: a warning, a power play, a reminder that Agrippina still had other pieces on the board. But here's the difference: now Nero wasn't a child anymore. A child. He was emperor, and for the first time in his life he had the power to push back. And deep down he must have realized something terrifying if he didn't do something soon. She'd never let him go. Chapter 5. Blood on the Table. There's something chilling about the moment someone chooses to kill family. Not in a fit of rage, not in self-defense, but in cold calculation. Not because they have to, but because they can. That moment came for Nero at 17. By then the tension between him and Agrippina had reached a silent, suffocating peak. She had lost control of him, and she knew it. He had begun carving out his own identity, drifting away from her rule, surrounding himself with flatterers, artists, and yes-men who made him feel like a god instead of a boy in his mother's shadow. But Agrippina wasn't the type to fade quietly. And when she started cozying up to Britannicus, Nero's stepbrother and former heir, it wasn't just emotional betrayal, it was political warfare. Imagine the message that sent. She, the woman who had erased Britannicus to make room for Nero, was now publicly embracing him, complimenting him, whispering his name in the right ears. She knew exactly what she was doing, and Nero knew too. He saw the threat. Britannicus was the biological son of Claudius. He had a stronger claim to the throne than Nero ever did. And even though Nero had the crown, legitimacy mattered in Rome. A whisper here, a scandal there, and it could all come crashing down. So Nero decided to eliminate the risk. Quietly. Permanently. It happened during dinner. That part really stuck with me, because there's something so mundane about it, so normal. People laughing, eating, drinking wine, a palace filled with important guests, senators, noblemen, the elite of Rome. No one suspected anything, until it happened. Britannicus lifted his cup, took a sip, and began to choke. At first, people thought he was reacting to the wine, maybe a cough, a bad swallow. But then he collapsed. His body started to convulse right there on the floor, and everyone froze. No one moved. No one helped. They just watched. And Nero. He didn't flinch. He calmly dabbed his mouth with a napkin and said something like, "Oh, don't worry. He's just having an epileptic episode. Happens all the time." But Britannicus didn't get back up. He died right there, in front of everyone. No one screamed. No one protested. And the message was loud and clear. Don't cross Nero. No official charges were brought. No one dared ask questions. It was ruled a natural death, or at least left unspoken. But everyone knew. Rome knew. That was the day the boy king became something else. And it was only the beginning. Because as much as Nero hated Britannicus, there was still one person he hated and feared even more. His mother. After the murder, Agrippina began to panic. She realized her son wasn't just pulling away. He was dangerous now, independent, unstoppable. She had raised him to be powerful, but she'd forgotten something crucial: power, once tasted, doesn't go back in the box. Nero didn't need her anymore. Worse, he saw her as a liability. And maybe she saw it coming. Maybe that's why she started threatening him quietly, of course, suggesting she could elevate another heir, perhaps someone younger, more obedient. Maybe she even reminded Nero that she still knew secrets that could ruin him. But threats only work when someone's afraid of the consequences. And Nero. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was angry. And he was calculating, just like she had taught him. and so he started to plot the unthinkable. Not just the murder of a rival, but the murder of the woman who made him king, his own mother. And this is where Nero's story stops being a political drama and begins to descend into pure psychological horror. Because what comes next isn't just betrayal, it's obsession, guilt, paranoia, and a murder so grotesque, it almost didn't feel real. Let's keep going. Chapter 6. How to Kill a Mother. There's something almost mythological about what happened next, so twisted, so layered that it feels like a Greek tragedy. But it was real. It happened. And the man at the center of it was Nero. By this point, Nero had done the unthinkable. He'd murdered Britannicus, his own stepbrother. And no one had stopped him. Not the Senate, not the people, not his advisors, and certainly not his mother. That silence, that lack of consequence, it did something to him, something irreversible. And now Agrippina was next. Let me pause here, because I think it's important to say this out loud. Agrippina was far from innocent. She manipulated, she schemed, she likely poisoned her way to power. She used her son as a weapon. But she was also the only person in Nero's life who had ever truly fought for him. Even if it was for her own gain, she built him. She protected him. She made him emperor, and now he was plotting her death. At first he tried to do it quietly. Poison. That was his go-to. It had worked for her before. Ironically, she was suspected of using it on Nero's father, and maybe even Claudius. But Agrippina was no fool. Some say she had spent years building immunity to poisons, taking small doses, just in case. Whether that's true or not, every attempt Nero made failed, and each failure made him more desperate. So he got creative. One night, he arranged for a section of her bedroom ceiling to collapse on her while she slept. It didn't work. The structure gave way, but somehow she survived. Minor injuries, nothing fatal. So then, get this, he designed a boat, a custom-built vessel that looked perfectly ordinary on the outside, but was rigged to collapse in the middle of the sea. That was the plan. Agrippina boards the boat, it falls apart. She drowns, clean, untraceable, an accident. And for a moment, it actually looked like it might work. Agrippina was invited on this lovely little voyage. She accepted, maybe suspicious, but playing along. And once they were out on open water, the boat began to break apart just as Nero had designed. People died. Crew members drowned. Chaos. But Agrippina didn't. Wearing full Roman robes, heavy-soaked, impossible to swim in, she somehow managed to survive. She swam to shore, bruised, shaken, but alive. And I can't help but imagine the look on Nero's face when he got the news. That after poison falling ceilings and a sinking death trap, she still wasn't dead. She was unkillable. And maybe that's when something in him broke, because his next move was simple. No more theatrics, no more plans. He just sent soldiers. Agrippina was in her villa recovering. She knew, of course she knew. And when the guards arrived, she didn't beg. She didn't plead. According to legend, she exposed her stomach and said, "Strike the womb that bore him." That line, it's haunted me, because it says everything. This wasn't just political. It wasn't just about power. This was deeply personal, symbolic. A mother acknowledging that she had created the very monster that now wanted her dead, and so they killed her. Agrippina, the younger sister of Caligula, wife of Claudius, mother of Nero, was gone. And Nero. He tried to act surprised, gave a public speech, pretended to mourn, played the innocent son. But no one bought it, no one believed him. And more importantly, something changed in him after that. Because even though Agrippina was gone, she never really left. He started to unravel. He drank more, slept less, became paranoid. Some said he had nightmares about her, visions of her ghost accusing him. Others said he spoke to statues, wandered the palace at night, lashing out at shadows. Killing her hadn't freed him. It had fractured him. And from that fracture, something even darker began to emerge. Let's keep going. Chapter 7. The city burns, and so does the truth. It happened in the summer of 64 AD. A fire broke out in the heart of Rome, and it didn't stop. For 6 days, 6 flames tore through the city, devouring entire districts. Homes, temples, marketplaces, gone. And just when people thought it was over, the fire flared back up. It raged for another 3 days. By the time the smoke cleared, 2/3 of Rome had been reduced to ash. I've thought a lot about what that must have felt like. Imagine waking up to the sound of screaming, seeing orange light dance through your window, running barefoot into the streets watching your home, the place you were born, raised, loved, worked collapse under the weight of smoke and heat. And there's nothing you can do. No fire department, no emergency system, just chaos, just flame. Thousands were left homeless, families wiped out, livelihoods destroyed. The city, once the pride of the empire, looked like a graveyard of stone and smoke. And in the middle of it all, people started asking the one question that always comes after disaster: who's to blame? At first, no one really knew where Nero was when the fire began. Some sources say he was at his villa outside the city. Others claim he rushed back to Rome and began organizing relief efforts, passing out supplies, opening his private gardens to shelter the homeless. But then, the rumors started. Whispers that he hadn't just known about the fire, but that he'd started it. That he'd watched from a balcony while playing the lyre singing of Troy as Rome burned below him. It sounds dramatic, maybe too dramatic, but in times of suffering, people look for symbols. And Nero, draped in purple robes while the world crumbled around him, became the perfect one. And honestly, the theory wasn't that far-fetched. See, just months before the fire, Nero had expressed frustration about the old, cramped layout of Rome. He'd talked openly about rebuilding the city in his image, with wide roads, marble buildings, and most notably a massive palace. A palace that would sit right where the fire just happened to do the most damage. It didn't help that soon after the fire, Nero did begin building. His new estate, called the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, wasn't just a home. It was an empire carved in gold, complete with man-made lakes, banquet halls, gardens, and a 100-foot bronze statue of himself. So yeah, people talked. A lot. And Nero. He needed a scapegoat. That's when he turned his gaze toward a new and unpopular group within Rome, the Christians. At the time, Christians were still a small, misunderstood sect. To many Romans, they were odd, secretive, and just strange. They didn't worship the traditional Roman gods. They gathered in private, and they talked about resurrection, blood sacrifice, things that felt dark, unfamiliar, maybe even dangerous. Perfect targets. Nero blamed the fire on them publicly, and the persecution began. And when I say persecution, I don't mean exile. I mean brutality. He rounded them up in massive numbers. Men, women, children, it didn't matter. They were tortured, executed, burned alive. Some were torn apart by wild animals in public arenas. Others were crucified and set on fire to serve as human torches for Nero's garden parties. That part always gets me. Human beings lit on fire just to light a dinner party. And the guests watched. That was Nero's Rome. Historians estimate that at least 900 Christians were killed during this purge. It was one of the earliest and most horrific state-sanctioned attacks against the Christian faith, and it all started as a distraction, a way to shift the blame, a way to control the narrative. And the worst part, it worked, for a while anyway. The fire was forgotten. The construction of Nero's Golden House continued. And though many people were still suspicious, they stayed silent, because in Nero's Rome, silence meant survival. But cracks were starting to form. Behind the gold, behind the marble, behind the music and the statues, the people had begun to whisper again, and this time, they were whispering about him. Let's keep going. Chapter 8. Love, Death, and the Illusion of Control. The thing about power is it doesn't just corrupt someone's politics. It corrupts their relationships too. After the fire, after the bloodshed, after the Christians were used as human shields for public outrage, Nero had everything he wanted. The city was his to rebuild. The palace of his dreams was finally rising from the ashes. and he still wore the crown. But in his private life, things were falling apart in ways that were somehow even darker than what he did in public. Let's start with Claudia Octavia Nero's first wife. She was the daughter of Claudius, the former emperor. A political match arranged by Nero's mother back when everything was still under her control. Octavia had the right bloodline, the right name, the right image. But what she didn't have was Nero's attention. He never loved her. By most accounts, he barely tolerated her. And over time, his contempt for her grew into something vicious. Octavia was quiet, dignified, publicly adored. She reminded people of a better time, a time before Rome was ruled by a boy king who played dress-up in a burning city. And that made her dangerous to Nero, not because of anything she said or did, but because of how people looked at her, with sympathy, with respect. That kind of admiration made Nero feel small, and Nero hated feeling small. So he started pushing her out of his life. Quietly at first, then violently. He accused her of infertility, claimed she couldn't give him a child. Then he accused her of adultery, a charge that in Rome could get a woman killed. There was no trial, no real evidence, just Nero's word, and that was enough. She was exiled, sent away to a remote island, and even then it wasn't enough. Nero sent orders to have her executed, but not in some quick, clean fashion. She was reportedly tied down, suffocated in a steam bath, and just to make sure her head was cut off and brought back to Rome, he had it delivered as a trophy. And that's when Poppaea enters the picture. Poppaea Sabina was everything Octavia wasn't. Glamorous, bold, flirtatious. She knew how to use her beauty as currency, and Nero was obsessed with her. She wasn't just a lover, she was a symbol of everything he thought he deserved. Passion, devotion, adoration. But it didn't take long for that obsession to turn toxic. Poppaea became pregnant with Nero's child, and at first he seemed overjoyed. He threw banquets in her honor, showered her with gifts, paraded her around like she was a living goddess. But behind closed doors, things were different. Nero was volatile, jealous, paranoid. Some say he didn't like how much attention she got. Others say she confronted him one night, maybe about his affairs, maybe about his temper, and he lost control. He kicked her hard. Poppaea, pregnant and defenseless, collapsed. A few days later, she died, along with their unborn child. And here's the thing, I don't think Nero meant to kill her. But he did. And when it happened, he unraveled in a way he hadn't before. Because this time, it wasn't a political rival or a calculated execution. This was personal. He mourned her in the only way he knew how, with drama, excess, and delusion. He embalmed her body with rare spices, held a massive public funeral, erected statues of her all over the empire. He wanted the world to see how heartbroken he was. But none of that grief changed the fact that he had destroyed the very thing he claimed to love. And what he did next might be the most disturbing chapter in his personal life. Not long after Poppaea's death, Nero met a young boy named Sporus. He was small, delicate, and Nero, in his twisted grief, decided the boy looked eerily similar to Poppaea. So he had him castrated, dressed him in silk gowns, painted his face with makeup, gave him jewelry veils titles, and then he married him in a full public ceremony, with all the rituals of a traditional Roman wedding. Nero played the groom, Sporus the bride, and from that moment on, he was no longer Sporus, he was called Sabina, Poppaea's name. It's horrifying to think about. A child forced to play the role of a dead woman, all to satisfy the fantasies of an emperor who couldn't face what he had done. Nero didn't just rewrite history, he tried to resurrect it. He tried to replace what he had broken with a living replica. And Sporus, he didn't have a choice. He was paraded through Rome, sat next to Nero at public events, slept in the imperial chambers, forced to smile through it all. And through this twisted romance, you can see just how far Nero had drifted from reality. He wasn't just corrupt anymore. He wasn't just cruel. He was lost, drowning in grief and guilt and power he didn't know how to control. And instead of facing his own reflection, he built a lie to stand in its place. But soon even that wouldn't be enough. Because when your entire life is built on illusion, the truth always finds a way to catch up. Let's keep going. Chapter 9. The Emperor Alone. By the time Nero entered his early 30s, the empire that once praised him as the Golden Prince was barely holding together. Rome was bleeding economically, politically, and morally. His public image was in pieces. The people who once feared him had begun to quietly despise him, and his inner circle, most of them, were either dead or waiting for the right moment to betray him. It's strange how quickly power can shift. For years, Nero had done whatever he wanted, killed whoever he pleased, rewritten the rules in his favor. But once he started seizing property from the rich, increasing taxes on the nobility, and accusing senators of treason just to get rid of them. He crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Because in Rome you could kill a sibling, you could murder your mother. You could even burn a city down and build a palace on top of the ashes. But the second you threatened the wealth and status of the powerful, your time was up. And that's exactly what happened. A quiet rebellion started in the provinces, then another, then another. Generals and governors who had once toasted to Nero's name now declared him unfit to rule. They were done. Rome was done. And for the first time in his life, Nero couldn't talk or sing his way out of it. The final blow came in 68 AD. A politician named Julius Vindex, yes, that's a real name, stood up and publicly declared that Nero was a disgrace to Rome. He urged the Senate to remove him, and shockingly they listened. The Senate turned on Nero. They declared him a public enemy, which under Roman law meant he was no longer protected by his title. Anyone could kill him without consequence. In fact, they were encouraged to. When Nero heard the news, he panicked. Completely unraveled, he ran, he hid. He begged his closest advisors to help him escape to the east, maybe, where he could reinvent himself as an artist, a poet, a singer. He even joked about becoming a civilian and living in peace. But no one was laughing. No one believed in him anymore. Even his most loyal servants began to disappear. Some fled. Some switched sides. And the one person he wanted to be with, Sporus, the boy he had made into a symbol of his grief, was powerless to help him now. In the end, Nero was left alone. He took refuge in a small villa on the outskirts of Rome. And when he heard that soldiers were on their way to arrest him, something finally clicked. This was it. The end. There would be no last performance, no encore. The same man who once forced thousands of people to watch him sing for hours now had no one to watch him die. According to the story, Nero paced the villa muttering to himself. He begged someone, anyone, to kill him. No one would. Not because they wanted to spare him, but because no one wanted to be him. No one wanted to be remembered as the person who ended Nero's story. Eventually, he took the blade himself. He pressed it to his neck, and as the soldiers closed in, he whispered what would become his last words. What an artist dies in me. That was it. At 30 years old, Nero, Rome's final emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, was gone. The last in the line of Augustus, the child of a mad mother, the boy who wanted to sing, the man who turned a throne into a stage and a stage into a grave. And when word of his death spread through Rome, there was no mourning, no mass funerals, no state tributes. In fact, most people breathed a little easier. Some even celebrated, but chaos followed. With Nero gone, the empire was thrown into a brutal power struggle. 4 emperors rose and fell in a single year. The vacuum he left behind was violent, unstable, and unforgettable. Still, for all his cruelty, for all his destruction, Nero became a legend, not because he was great, but because he was a warning, a cautionary tale about what happens when a child is handed a kingdom, when ego goes unchecked, when grief becomes theater, when no one is allowed to say no, and I think about that a lot. Because in the end, Nero wasn't just a monster. He was a mirror reflecting everything Rome wanted to ignore, and like all mirrors, eventually he shattered. Let's go to the final chapter. Chapter 10. A Crown of Smoke. So that was Nero, the boy emperor, the artist king, the tyrant who turned murder into routine and grief into theater. And now that we've reached the end of his story, I keep thinking about how it all began. Not with power, not with fire, but with a boy. A boy born into chaos with a violent father and a mother who saw him less as a son and more as a weapon. A boy who was never really raised, only used, groomed, polished like a coin for public display. And when that boy finally held the reins of an empire, is it any wonder he didn't know how to carry the weight? It doesn't excuse what he did. Not the executions, not the persecution, not the cruelty, but it does make you ask how many tragedies in history began with someone who was hurt. Long before they became dangerous, Nero's story is dramatic, yes, almost unreal at times. It has every ingredient of a dark myth: murder, betrayal, ambition, grief, ego spectacle. But it's also familiar, because even now, centuries later, we still see people chasing power not out of vision, but out of fear, out of hunger, out of emptiness. We still see what happens when no one is willing to say enough, when narcissism is celebrated, when applause becomes more important than truth. In the end, Nero didn't just burn Rome. He burned bridges. He burned people. He burned the very legacy he thought he was building. And yet his name lived on. In books, in plays, in whispers, in warnings. He became a symbol of everything that can go wrong when image becomes identity and power becomes performance. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if someone had just told him no. If someone had pulled him aside early enough and reminded him he was still human. Maybe it wouldn't have changed anything. Maybe he was too far gone. But maybe it would have saved more than just a city. Thank you for walking through this story with me. And remember, history doesn't just live in textbooks. It breathes. It echoes. And sometimes, if we listen closely enough, it teaches us how not to repeat it. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Nero's story may have ended with a blade in his neck and an empire in ruins, but his legacy never really died. It lives on in every warning about unchecked ego, in every leader more obsessed with applause than responsibility, in every system that silences truth just to protect power. And maybe in the quietest corners of history, Nero isn't a monster to be studied, but a mirror we'd rather not look into. If this story stayed with you or made you see history in a new light, don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, and share your thoughts below. This is where we tell the stories that history tried to bury. Thanks for listening. Until next time, this is True Crime Echoes, where the past doesn't sleep, it haunts.